hands down.
Okay, so this one very hot July 6th in Boulder.
Beads of sweat will be appearing on our foreheads as we talk.
We're not doing that kind of film. Anyway, as I was telling Ann, I didn't make a outline of questions and stuff. What I'd rather like to do is just take a couple of prompts from the Brakhage scrapbook and just get you to talk a little bit about the issue. The one thing that's striking for people who don't know your whole career, as I've discovered when I've mentioned that we were going to do this interview to a number of people, particularly people who've just seen the works that have, as you used to put it, no nameable objects and no words in them. Such people might be surprised at just how intimate your involvement with poetry has been your whole life. And in the Brakhage scrapbook, in a piece called 8 Questions, when we start to talk about your third film, say, when I began my third film, I had no money at all. I still wasn't convinced that I was a filmmaker. Like Jean Cocteau, I was a poet who also made films. This is how I thought of myself. I was Denver's Jean Cocteau. And of course, the two things I'm interested in there are the fact that as your third film, you still weren't convinced that you were a filmmaker. But I'm even more interested in this.
I was still hoping against hope that I would avoid this dreadful fate.
But you really thought of yourself as a poet who made films? Is it?
Though what was finally to end that was living with Robert Duncan, who is such a great poet, and whose living with him also put me in touch with so many poets. They came regularly to his home to talk and to read poetry, and so Spicer and Blazer and Michael McClure and people who were born not far from where I was and were my age that I met there, like Michael McClure. I was kind of the houseboy in a way. That is, I was given my room in exchange for doing the dishes and cleaning up and so on. And that room actually was extraordinary. That was such a gift beyond just being a place to sleep. Because it had in it stored, it was the storage room of James Broughton's material, so it had all of his outtakes, his what could you call his first print of many of his films, where you could study his editing in some detail. And one thing that Broughton certainly was, he's one, and still is, in my mind, one of the great editors in the history of cinema. He stretched time and he abbreviated it, and he did this rather continually in his making. And so I had, excuse me, a chance to study that material, at leisure. All these boxes were sitting there with all these work prints in them. In addition to which, Broughton, spending the last of his inheritance, had acquired a lot of great painting of Clifford Still. He had 2 or 3 Clifford Stills. He had Diebenkorn, Bishop, Hassel Smith, the great painters of that period of San Francisco painter Renaissance, as it later came to be called. And some unknown people like the sculptures of Miriam Hopkins and people that I think should not be unknown, but anyway, they were. All this I could choose, sort of among all these canvases piled up in the garage next door, what I wanted to put up in my room. It was astonishing, and I received these paintings in a wonderful way. They weren't famous yet. They didn't have this enormous price tag. He had several $100,000 worth of, by today's prices, of Broughton, stored down there. But they didn't come with that, since they came with this. I received them as art, and put them up in my little hovel. I had a hot plate where I cooked my meals that I ate by myself. But Duncan and Jess always gave me lunch and usually dinner as well. And I was always there when people would come over and read or talk and so on. So that's where I met Kenneth Anger, for example. It wasn't just filmmakers, it was a wide variety of people that sought out Robert Duncan as the kind of, there were three salons, you could say, in San Francisco at that time among the poets. One was Kenneth Patchen's, and I went to that one also for a while. The other was Kenneth Rexroth's, and the third was Robert Duncan's. And Duncan's was certainly the one, the most exclusive, and the one I kind of gravitated to, the most private and hermetic in a way, the most bitchy, the most...
well, that might be, Spicer's group met over in a bar instead of having a salon sort of
Right.
thing. They might have beaten him in that category a little bit.
Probably would have. I never liked Spicer. I found him very rude and mean, basically, from the start. Though I have subsequently come to respect him as one of the greatest poets of that period. He's absolutely, in my mind, he's equal to Duncan and certainly, well, I don't play baseball with the poets, but I mean, he's certainly one of the greatest poets, I think, of the 20th century. But personally, he was just, as one has read or or knows,
he has the reputation for being difficult.
Really mean guy. And I was a tender neophyte. Well, I think I described them best. I called them patty poems.
Patty? P-A-T-T?
Yeah. Like patty cake.
Oh, rhythmically. Okay.
No, not rhythmically. More the sense of they were slight. I didn't want to take on airs, which was wise of me because I was not a poet, as I was subsequently to learn by just living among real poets, that's not what I was. But I even before I knew that, I didn't want to take on airs in relationship to poetry, and I really feel, magically speaking, that because I didn't blaspheme against poetry, as so many have
There's our
in
title.
our time, I was permitted to work with film, and that film was given to me to work with. You could also say that because I didn't really know what poetry was and had been to some extent presumptuous when I was younger, it was forbidden to me forever. So I really understand Jean Cocteau's sense of the muse, which, by the way, was very much Robert Duncan's too. She's not an easy entity to deal with, and she'll put a spear right through your heart if you show timorousness, or as Cocteau has it in the Testament of Orpheus. And she certainly won't put up. She's like, ignorance of the law is no excuse. And so, in a way, the thing that I'd wanted to be since I was 9 years old was not possible because I'd been presumptuous about poetry, not knowing any better from the back. That's my only excuse, But again, that doesn't serve with the muse. I didn't have a culture sufficient to permit me to be a writer of poetry. But what gave me the magic, and I feel very much the magic persuasions and help that I've had across my life, is that I didn't lie about it. I didn't make fake poems beyond a certain point. And that was across a period of living with Duncan and really coming to understand and feel what a sacred task and the specifics of that task of making poetry, and that I wasn't that. That was not what I was.
But you were, you mentioned in discussing the cyst film, and is that still before the experience with Duncan?
Well, I had met Duncan, but only briefly.
Because the thing that intrigues me, you said about that film that it prophesied the concept of the Beat Generation. So obviously you were thinking along some of the same lines as many poets that you were...
Again, you must remember that's written sort of after the fact, in a way.
Right.
Beat was in the air, that word was kind of in the air. North Beach was a beat generation hangout. For me, it was a place where I went to a Basque restaurant where I got very good stew, very inexpensively, with a little wine. They'd always serve wine in a Coke bottle, and you could eat, I think the whole thing cost 75 cents, stew, dinner, some sort, and some little Coke bottle of wine. And I wasn't really involved. There was no city lights at that time. It was a hangout, though, for a number of people, most notably those I was later to know, Christopher McLean. And also the painters that I was to know hung out there, that I was to come to know by living with their paintings in Rowton's basement. 1724 Baker was Broughton's home, and he had sort of given it over to Robert Collins and Jess Collins and Robert Duncan when he went to Europe. He went to Europe to flee a paternity suit. Pauline Kael had got him drunk one night and got pregnant from him, and she fled. He fled to Europe, really. I must say, in fairness, he supported the child then, with the last of whatever. He didn't have much money left, but he did give support to the child economically, but he certainly was not in love with Pauline Kael, and he was not she felt that he could be heterosexual. Now, further irony is later he did make a trial at that, and he fathered 2 children. But at this time he just fled with the man who played the American Fairy Cowboy in his early films. I'll think of his name in a minute, but he just fled to Europe and then burned up much of the rest of his fortune making the garden film in London. But anyway, Pauline Kael then turned very bitter against independent filmmakers, and so that she did a lot of harm. Actually, she would write things. She was very witty, very intelligent. She'd write things like, "Every time I see an experimental film, what I really want to do then is go immediately to a movie." And that, a lot of people said, yes, that's the way I feel. I've tortured my brain. I don't understand it. What I need is a movie. And she, part of her whole reputation was built on hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Though, in a way, she certainly had asked for it, because she deliberately set about to trap Broughton. And he fled to Europe, left his home and apartment to Robert and Jess. And then I came along, and they needed, because Jess was working as a dental assistant, and Robert was going over every day to Berkeley to type to make a living. They needed someone to help clean the house, keep the house clean, and feed the cats, and wash the dishes, and so on. And so they offered me this basement room.
Now, how did you come to know them in the first place?
Robert had heard about me through, I think, Rexroth. And he came to visit, and he was intrigued at what I was doing. I also had some patty poems, as I would have called them, which I handed to him, which he did not think much of, but he knew I was a serious person, and I don't know if he saw film at that time. But anyway, I went away for a summer, then came back, and the minute I came back, I went to visit Robert and Jess, and I said, well, I'm looking for an apartment. They said, well, why don't you stay here? You can have this free if you'll clean the place. And so that's how I came to live with them on and off for 2 years, really, a year and a half.
And what years were they?
That's going to be tough. Let's see. Late 50s.
Okay. Yeah. Well, speaking of wit, you also, in talking about the Sis film, talking about this joke you guys used to have about disessentialism.
Yes, existentialism.
And he said we've got beyond the stage of existentialism, we've got the stage of disessentialism.
Desisting.
Desisting. What? Desisting from everything? Or?
Yeah, everything. I mean, though it was kind of a joke, but in another way it was quite serious. I mean, I and all my friends had reached a point where there did not seem to be any viable path of serious endeavor. I mean, none. And so we had planned to make a film called Christ Film, and that was to be I was saving money for it, and Larry Jordan bought a truck for it. Others were gathering monies also that had come back disillusioned with college, and having none of us failed at college, but all of us were disillusioned with it. Newcomb had a couple of years in the Marine Reserves and was totally shot from that, was out stealing hubcaps and so on. And I mean, all these gathering of people were had reached the end of their rope. And we agreed we would all go and we'd make a long film. We'd live together in a truck, which Larry had bought, and we would make a long film on the modern Christ, who would be envisioned as an idiot who, because of the strange things he says, is worshipped and misunderstood by the current populace to some extent. That's a picture.
More magic interventions.
Yeah. Anyway, so it was very exciting time in a way, but also a very terrible time, because Benson began cracking up under the chore of, Benson is the one who plays Blue Moses in Blue Moses. He was to play Christ, and he begins cracking up under the pressures of that. And finally it became obvious to us we were not going to be able to do that. And so then we decided to go to San Francisco and do it. But before we did that, as all we could afford, actually, at this point, were some outdated gun camera film from the Second World War. Film that was from 50-foot spools that was supposed to be for shooting down Japanese planes or whatever.
50 feet's enough for that, I suppose.
Yeah. So we spooled that together and spliced it in the dark and put it all together and made this expression of our personal disturbances and unhappinesses with the culture and with ourselves and so on. So that's how this film came to be made. It was made in this shack that Larry was living in at the time. A lot of people thought it was like a pot film, but it was just cigarettes. It was cigarettes and wine, that's all. That was sufficient for us. And people smoked rather forcefully, which has led some to think it was an early marijuana film, but it wasn't.
Just forceful smoking.
Forceful, forceful inhaling.
So like movie smoking.
Yeah. So we made that film, and I had that when I went back to San Francisco, and that was very impressive to Robert and to Jess and others, because suddenly I was making film that was more consonant with the Broughton and Peterson films, or with Chris McLean, and others that Stoffaker was presenting at the museum there under what was called Art in Cinema. Let me get a break here. I'll just put this picture back up before I forget where it goes.
You need a chair?
God, I don't even know who this baby is.
You know what this is reminding me of, man.
I don't know what baby that is. That one is this guy's child, Hurwitz. I don't know who that baby is, but it's a baby.
Just before we got married, I went to visit him and his mother, and they had this big plastic bag full of family photos going back years, and they had they were spreading it out on the coffee table and giving me the whole family history. And there was this one tiny little picture of this little white baby, and I just said, who's that? And I said, I don't know. And she asked them all, who's that? And nobody could remember who this little white baby was. And finally, her mother remembered that it was the child of a family she used to work with years and years ago. But yeah, going back.
Well, most of these are my children, but these are my grandchildren. This is Rose Harmony, and Rhea, and Iona, who's just graduated from high school, and Marina and Rose Harmony, and let's see, over here I have Desiree, and you have Rourke's children, and Brianna, and I'm just, and I'm loaded. I guess some of the other grandchildren I've got over here. Here's Clancy, who's come now to grace. Marina's had 2 marriages, both of which have failed, but produced this beautiful child and this beautiful child. And so I have what I don't have, because Bertham is so slovenly in respect to these things, I don't have his Molly and the coal. It makes me feel like calling him immediately and making a fuss. This is me when with the boys when they were very much younger, being the father of the sea, you know, and I'm photographing the ocean and they're building their sandcastles, and so. But I have altogether, 2 of them I probably won't see again, but I have 13 grandchildren. 2 of them in such a divided marriage that I, alas, probably won't see them again. But maybe when I'm grown sometime.
Maybe when you're grown sometime?
Yeah, when I'm grown. When I'm ripe for it.
Right.
Also, there's the photograph there from when the Toronto trip was down making the documentary about it.
Oh, yeah. And of course, all my kids are in here and everything. Phil Solomon thinks that this is because I no longer make films of my life, biographical films, that this is what I do instead, is make all these still pictures I hang them up, most of which are shot by Marilyn.
Of course, I'm thinking if the day ever comes that you do retire, they ought to make this a historic place.
Well, they'll be so glad to have the room. They'll clean it out as quickly as possible, and anything we don't grab, they'll throw in the junk heap. But I have a lot of dear things in here that do touch me, and I do look at these things. They don't just disappear like a lot of things do on the wall. I'm really involved in not only the children, but of course the pictures from Chartres Cathedral, and the drawings of children and the snowman, and of course in the stomach.
Really?
He's painted over an enlarged photograph of his wound, and eventually that did bring me in along with happiness of his life.
Who's this painter again, Stan?
Paul Sheretz, who's made a number of films. He's kind of holding his hand, showing his wound, which is the reason he's done that. This is in the shape of the United States to some extent. And that's his identification. And then, I have all these posters here of painters like this. That's James Herbert, who made Cantico and made all these wonderful, beautifully mad films of nudes in old houses in Athens, Georgia. That's Hurwitz, Peter Hurwitz, the lower 2 that go together. And so on. There's James Davis back there, there's Diana Barry, there's Ann Ellis, and then there's a couple of prints of Whistler. Thank God, I wouldn't want to have a real Whistler but watercolor, because I'd be terrified. But I have really good prints. You could really make good reproductions of watercolors, and those are basically very inspiring to me. Those paintings that he made when he gave up his career, and he just painted on people's cigar box lids. His watercolors, he carried in one pocket watercolors and the other cigar box lids that his friends would give him, and did this whole wonderful series of watercolors that had no viability for selling or no interest to anybody at all. He just had his life, as an artist, which is hard to do when you get famous and have made money. My big break is I've never really made any money, so I'm not that famous, and so I'm not that tormented by the whole shtick. But
we're sort of moving backwards in time from San Francisco, then we'll move forward again later. But you mentioned that as a teenager you were always carrying books around. You said you got a reputation for being one of those people who carries books around when they don't have to. But you also said at that time that Ezra Pound's Cantos was, if you had to choose one book, the single most important book in your life. And
yes.
I'm wondering if A, if you still feel that way, and B, if you can say a little bit about its importance to you.
Well, its importance to me, I mean, there's about a third of it is, I think, the greatest writing about light in many hundreds of years, since the light philosophers, since Bacon and Duns Scotus Origina. No one has written so magnificently about light as then that's maybe 1/3 of the cantos. Then another third is about economics, which, so far as I've been able to figure out, is just really crank economics. And then another third is just hate. It's spewing forth hate against the Jews primarily, and a kind of terrible racism that runs through it. And so it's a flawed, monstrous work in a way. But in terms of that 1/3 that's about light, it is, yes, probably the most inspiring poetry for me personally that's been written in the 20th century. Though there's a close contender, which is Ronald Johnson, as you know, who's written about light as well as other things, and with a beneficence and a wonderful attitude. And I have no real quarrels with Ronald Johnson's epic, as practically anyone of any sense would have to have with Pounds. I'm also very fond of Zukowski's A, which is very moving to me. It's very hard for me to read, like I think it is for almost everyone, but I keep struggling with it, and it sustains itself, and it seems a completed epic. And HD, as Helen in Egypt, is very important to me, and I'm now looking into Doughty finally, after years of kind of picking it up and saying, oh, it's too hard, I can't deal with it. It's finally got Wanderings in Arabia. But what I don't know is Wanderings in Arabia is not the same as Arabia Deserta, is it?
I don't think so, but this is outside my area.
So I have to look into that. And then, of course, there's Charles Olson, who I'm very much reminded of because I just saw in the movies wonderful images from Gloucester. This famous sailor's bar that they photograph in
Was it in the Perfect Storm?
Yeah,
Oh, I see.
in The Perfect Storm is where I had breakfast with Charles Olson and that wonderful several days that I went and talked with him.
You're going to have to tell me more about that trip. I was going to ask you about Olson anyway. I remember in lecture intended, which is 1967. And I wonder if this is the trip you're talking about. He said, Charles Olson once said to me that a town, however large it becomes, always remains what it was at scratch.
That's something he did say to me on that trip, yes.
In
In fact, I only had really, I had several days, and that's all I really had of Olson. The rest, he didn't write to me. So, I had a lot of stories that came through Creeley and others that I was close to, Dorn, about Olson, and I was always kind of, in that sense, in touch with Olson in his life, but particularly when his wife died, I was back east, and I tried to go visit him, but he was just so shattered, he couldn't receive anybody. I, of course, offered every kind of help that I could. But
you had been visiting in Gloucester this one time.
Yeah, and I was there for several days, and it was a fulsome visit with many exchanges, and I've written, maybe my best writing is this letter to Jane about my visit with Olson, because I'm completely given over to trying to give people some sense of his largesse and his greatness, and the clarities that he gave to me, which have been life-lasting. I think the person that I most often quote in class is Charles Olson. Not Pound, but Olson, though Pound gets quoted a lot too, but mostly Olson.
Is it a name your students know when you mention it?
No, not these days.
He's
slipping out of...
Exactly, he looms so enormously over the poetry world of the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
What's happening, it's not, some of the language poets who were deeply influenced by him were questioning some of his assumptions about presence of the body and so forth. That's not what's happening. It's not that people are having an argument with him. What's happening is people are just stopping to knowing about him. It's profoundly disturbing situation.
Well, there's always a period where when someone dies, people try to get rid of them. I mean, it's like we have too much. And for those that are devoted to the arts, they're sort of overwhelmed with this historical largesse, and so people make that attempt. And then when they can't do that, then they embrace them and canonize them. Think of the case of Melville, for example, and I feel probably Olson would be in some similar position, and somewhere 10 years from now or something, he'll be rediscovered. And I think, as a matter of fact, the book The Perfect Storm owes something to Olson. I don't know the author, so I'd have to ask, but it's a good book. What makes it good is that it has certain attitudes toward Gloucester and toward fishing that are right out of Gloucester. Now, he may have arrived at those on his own, but I just really wonder if he hasn't at least, he would almost have to have read something of Charles Olson. Because, for instance, the description of the turning over and the sinking of a certain ship in the Maximus poems is certainly echoed very acutely in The Perfect Storm as a book. And the movie. The movie's wonderful because it does just what a book can't. I mean, it just really presents this storm in vision, and it's really quite a good movie, I think.
Well, the meteorological historians tell me that boat actually sank in the first of the two storms that met. So apparently they've moved the story around a little bit. That probably is true of the book too. Now I'm going to go see that movie. I was sort of avoiding it before.
No, I think it's a good movie. I think you'll like it. The images of Gloucester are quite nice too.
You were talking about the elegy of Hamlet in the letter to P.M. Sidney. You talked about Pound's escaping Circe's hell does make a hell for others, and the grotesqueries of his prejudice. You have this delightful image, you have this image of a hell that snaps back over itself in old age. That's one of the sharper ways of looking at what happened at the Pound that I've ever seen, actually. Because what happens, people tend either to deny these problems of Pound's work. There are critics even now that try to tell you that, yes, he was an anti-Semite, but he kept it out of his poetry. I don't know how you can possibly say
that's ridiculous.
On the other hand, you have people who just refuse to read him, and this way of looking at it...
That's also ridiculous.
This way of looking at it... Forget that idea of it snapping back.
Let him who is, how does the Bible have it? Let him who
without sin cast the first stone.
Exactly. He had his sins, and they were huge. He was a huge man, and he had huge sins, and he was honest about them. He didn't hide them. They are, if you want to learn about prejudice, there's no better text you can turn to than the Counts.
Well, even Olson, maybe it was because of the personal contact, but even Olson finally reached a point where he had to just turn away from Pound and stop visiting.
Turn away from him as a person, but not his poetry.
No,
He never denied his poetry or the power of it. And so he had a hell of a life. Actually, he certainly suffered for his sins, like people do on earth. I don't know why it seems so difficult for people to recognize how people suffer. All you have to do is look at the avaricious and rich and how miserable their lives are. They make a misery beyond anything imaginable. So you really feel we should send social workers out to Gun Barrel Acres to try to help these people. Get them doing shuffleboard or some damn thing, They're sitting locked in their houses, despising each other, and you live a little bit and you understand how people pay for their mistakes.
I always suspected that the reason that Hollywood was always trying to convince us that rich people are so miserable so that none of us will try to be that.
Well, but you don't need to turn to Hollywood. You just need to know a few rich people, as I've known, and even the nicest of them have certainly the major center of their life was absolutely miserable suffering. For instance, Jerome Hill was one of the most generous, sweet, and intrinsically kind people I've known. He's the only real gentleman that I've ever known, and I really understand what the term gentleman meant in the 19th century by my memories of Jerome Hill. But on the other hand, Jerome's life was a living hell of his the galleries refusing to put up his paintings because they'd be considered having sold out to the Hill fortune, because his grandfather was this monstrous strike breaker, who ran the north-south railways and was the most awful, the absolute opposite of the old Joe Hill, in terms of his breaking of the unions and so on. And here's little Jerome, that's his grandfather, and he's growing up with all this wealth and in confusion, and literally comes at a point when he enters puberty where he can't remember anything for like 20 years. You know, he has no memories of his puberty and his young manhood. And then suddenly he falls in love and is rejected, and that's the end of that for him. He was that degree of romantic. And he makes this fantastic and wonderful film, which is very much ahead of its time in a pure filmic poem called the Card Reader, or the Cartomancier. And no one will show that in relationship to it. If it had been shown with Man Ray and Dolly Buñuel and so on and so forth, it would be an established classic of avant-garde film, but no one would show it, no one would do his paintings. A gallery had taken on his paintings, and then when they learned he was the son of the Hill fortune, they called him on and said, "We're sorry, but it would destroy our reputation. People would assume we've been bought off if we showed your paintings." That was his life.
It's okay to be bought off, you just want to give the appearance of being bought off.
Well, I mean, his whole life was a great sadness, and it was all due to the money, even though he himself was a really sweet, nice person. So, I mean, I've seen money destroy in one way or another every rich person I've known. And I've known quite a few. You know. They don't dare. I mean, they always show up. My experience of rich people is they show up without having their they have no money, and they have no checkbook. They've forgotten their checkbook, and they show up so that you have to pay for their lunch. Because if you don't pay for their lunch, they don't know that you aren't eating with them just for their money. And I mean, they don't. I know that I've learned the hard way. They do this unconsciously. They just do it. You know, even Jerome did that. He never went around with any money. He always had a few things wadded up in his many pockets of his wealthy suits or whatever. But if he went through a few cabs, by the time he got to you, he wouldn't have any money. So you have to pay for his meals or whatever.
It's a little bit like
Family wouldn't let him have any money because he was the black sheep.
Oh,
of
that's a
the
little
family.
different, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they wouldn't let him have any money also. And he used to hide $20 bills in the bricks of the Algonquin Hotel where he lived, so that when he arrived late at night with the cab driver, he wouldn't have to go all the way into the desk to cash a check to get some money to pay the cab. He would just look out the window and say, "Oh, wait a minute," and he'd run over to the wall and pluck a $20 bill out of the bricks. Can you imagine what that must have made cab drivers feel like? They felt like, God, the rich just have eyes that see money in the walls, in the cracks of the wall, you know. So.
Let me take you back to that meeting with Rexroth.
Yeah.
In Poetry and Film. This is a little kind of a lengthy quote, so bear with me. You say this is one of the greatest lessons you ever had in poetry. One night you were invited over to Rexroth's house, early 50s, San Francisco.
Yeah.
You go on to say, on this particular night, a man from India began to read Tagore in Bengali.
Oh, yes.
He said, I've read a lot of translated Tagore, and I never liked it very much, but now out came these extraordinarily beautiful sounds. First of all, I was learning that poetry was not translatable. Second, because this was such a great experience, I realized how important it was to approach poetry first through its sounds. And then you make a parallel. Then I learned later that was a way for some people to approach film first, just through its vision. And I was thinking about this actually at this conference when they were showing Marflight and Mary Menken. People kept saying these are poetic films, but never said what they meant by that. And
Well, you mean they're weird?
I sort of suspected that. I was wondering if what they were trying to get at was the approach to vision and as parallel to the approach to sound in poetry.
I think there's, there's that implicit in it. People have a sense of what poetry is. They might choose fake poets, but they do have some sense of the distinction between an attempt to make a poem and to make a short story or a novel. And so I think that notion is also something they feel in relationship to these, particularly these lyric, symbolic, brief, almost dream films that are intrinsic to the independent film movement. But
let me pick up on your mention of the word lyric. In in a note to Robert Kelly's songs 1 through 30, he mentions in the back that you had told him that your film, it's called Songs actually. My note, I've lost my note. Had been inspired by, here it is. Brakhage once told me that the notion of calling his adamantine 8mm films songs came to him from me. And I'm wondering just, what the analogy is between song or lyric and the...
That's a quote of Kelly.
Yeah, that's Kelly. No, that's him calling your films adamantine.
Well, I mean, it came from him in a way, but more clearly it came from Ezra Pound. Because I quote, not at the contents, but I quote, in fact, in relation to the songs quite often, "Go little naked and impudent songs, ring the doorbell of the bourgeoisie, tell them you do no work and you will live forever." I mean, and this was a credo that was deeply meaningful for me just to be able to stagger on, because everything had failed for me at this time in my life, and my 16mm equipment had been stolen. So I had no way to proceed except I had some money. We were staying with my wife's parents again, which was, of course, that kind of defeat that it was intrinsically is. However kind they were, it was an awful defeat. And we had 3 children at this point, so it was also a heavy burden on them, defeat for them too, I would suppose. And I have some money to go and get some groceries so that we're not just eating their food. We have a little bit of money, and I go out. And I see in this window, right up on Broadway here, there was an old photo store where now there is a Chinese Korean restaurant. And that photo store had in a shoebox everything you need to make an regular 8mm film, including 4 or 5 unexposed rolls and a couple of exposed rolls. And all of it going for, I think, $20, something like that. So I spent half the food money I had to buy this box and bring all this home along with half of the groceries that I was to get. And that started I started making Song 1 that night. And I thought, I'm completely reduced, I'm completely destroyed, except I can make something that's absolutely useless. I by now was very clear this is not going to give me any kind of career. There's no money in this at all. And these are just, they are like the kind of impositions upon a society that nakedness is. So it was go little naked and impudent songs, that I would have the impudence under these circumstances, reduced to living with my in-laws who had such a deep suspicion of what I was doing that when my book was published, Metaphors on Vision, which I thought would give them some hope for me, they dusted around it for 3 years and never touched where I laid it down on the piano. I watched them dust around it. I mean, they didn't do this consciously. They didn't want to touch it. They didn't believe in it. They thought their daughter had gone mad and married this insane man. And here were these children. I mean, the children were the only thing that were giving us mercy there.
Well, that also reminds me of those Olsen lines, "Go contrary, go sing."
Oh, yes.
Yeah. He writes those when he's still living in D.C. in the 50s. That's when he's been, that's the Maximus letter where he's been riding on the trolley cars listening to the piped-in music. It says, "Go contrary, go sing."
I more thought, as I had been doing the songs first, I thought that Kelly's songs were more, because I had done some songs, but it doesn't matter. I mean, that gets in the air. I'm about to use a title that comes originally, I believe, from Chalicha, describing his failed old age work to create a paradise, and is a literal title of a Kenneth Patchen book, Panels for the Walls of Heaven. And I need this title, that's all, so I'm going to pay tribute to its source, but this title really expresses exactly what it is that I'm now trying to do, which is in the 4th part of the Vancouver Island films, which have so far been long photograph films. I am going to attempt to paint a 4th part, which will follow the 3rd part, which is the god of day had gone down upon him, which really is the old age and the crisis of facing death. And then I want to do Panels for the Walls of Heaven, and I'm gathering all my materials to take to Vancouver this year. No camera this time, just...
Have you been painting the film in the last few years?
Oh yeah, constantly. Yeah, constantly. Most of my work is painted, but I have never painted the Vancouver Island films, as they tend to be called. So now I'm going to do this fourth section, or if it's worthy, I will use this title. And so that's my current occupation.
When you say lyric, you're speaking of the film, what kind of musicality are you addressing?
Well, I'm thinking the young poets. Usually lyric dies as people get older. And I must say, I don't as easily make a dance or a melodic song as younger poets do. As I get older, also the lyric mode becomes more and more rare in my experience, but still, often enough, I don't make that many photograph films, but when I do, I think they still are intrinsically lyric. I think you can tell by the title. Worm and Web Love is a lyric poem in the modern mode, in some sense, and it's a portrait of Michael McClure and Amy Evans. And I mean, we didn't know what we were going to do. In a way, there was the thought that they might make love, and I would photograph them naked making love, and that didn't seem right to do, and everything was going wrong with the equipment and everything. So suddenly I just said, well, look, just sit there, you know, and I will try. And I had, even by this time, I burned out some other footage, and literally a roll of it fell in the toilet when I was trying to change films in the bathroom, and I was just thought it was totally hopeless.
What year was this?
Oh, yeah, last year. Yeah, last summer. So I came out, and I just wanted to give a record, at least to give them something. You know, I came out with no presumption whatsoever, in no sense that I was making a film, and I just wanted to give them a record so it wasn't a total bust, and they'd have some record of them. And then suddenly something started, and then when we went to Vancouver later in the summer, I took other images, the worm and the spider web and things of that sort, and wove them into this, and came out with, I think, a lyric poem, which is quite surprising at my age to be able to do such a thing. I really, and I made another one also, in as much as we went whale hunting. We paid $250 to go with some other tourists on a boat, Marilyn and I and the two boys, to search for whales. Well, Anton has dreamed of seeing whales his whole life long. A lot of people have, but I mean, he's been especially fervent about this. And I thought, well, they warned us. They said, probably we go around, we may not see any whales, but we'll go and we'll get you some dolphins or some walruses or something before we're through. And we're going, nothing's happening. So I finally, I start photographing the ocean in desperation, and I was trying to be a whale. I thought, I'm a whale, and I began photographing. Now, this is a lyric impulse. This is certainly not, as I'm expressing it, I think, an epic impulse or a rhetorical impulse, or it could be, I suppose. But, I mean, I'm just trying to do something in the teeth of nothing, you know, and suddenly, almost as if this act had called us forth, 30 whales surrounded this boat. And the people running the boat said they'd never seen anything like it. The boys were ecstatic. I was terrified they were going to fall overboard at any moment. And I'm photographing whales. There's whales everywhere, you know. So I made a film called Moilsome Toilsome. And that's, I think, a lyric film.
Well, you're making me think of Wilson again, because, I mean, lyric is so often associated not just with the musicality, but with a particular, first-person subjectivity.
Yeah. I think that would be Sidney's clarity and designation about my work, yes.
But, in Olson you get this sort of different kind of lyric, which sounds a little bit like what you described it too. And you said one of the things that interested you in Olson was the energy of immediacy, the actual breath and physiology of the living person being present. Now, of course, that's one of the things that some later poets would have doubts about in Olson's aesthetic, but it's an appealing idea, this idea of the presence of the artist in the art. But that kind of immediacy in the lyrics seems to be very much what we talk about in these films.
Well, the basis for this, for me, is that I believe I'm an instrument at best. When I can let go enough that something which you can call the muse, or God, or elves, or demon, or daemon, or I don't think demon, I sort of resist all that Kenneth Anger stuff, but something, a muse, has been our standard term for it, a kind of trance state, where I allow myself and my life's experiences and my mastery of the camera equipment or of the paints or whatever to be used fully. If I can do that, then I think the film is made through me. But it is made through me through what I have to contribute is most deeply is the lyric quality, that is the first person singularity, because there's no one else that's at all like me, any more than there's anyone like anybody else. I have to quickly follow with that, or people will think it's a statement of hubris. On the contrary, I think there's no two people at all alike, and what we have to contribute is absolutely unique if we can do it, and then we share that with each other through the arts or many other means, through love and through raising children and through just walking down the street. You share so much of what you uniquely are with people that move around you. And so the art is my way, because I feel born to it. But yes, the lyric part is the extent to which I can lend all of my first-person singularity to what I do not know. Because I tell you, most of the time I was photographing that film, I was in such a trance. I didn't know whether I was photographing whales or waves or baby whale or mother whale or what. And I was also had one eye out watching the children. I knew Marilyn was hovering over them, but I was a little nervous because they just went crazy, and naturally they went with the energy and excitement. So I'm kind of watching them, and I'm sort of, just running the camera and winding, then run some more, and all in a blur, and then comes back this footage, which makes a film that's of absolutely no interest to the avant-garde or to the film clubs or whatever. They think, well, Brakhage did this for his kids or whatever. But I think it's a lovely film, actually. I'm very pleased with it, that I still can, how can I say, it's hard as you get older, your muscles don't, I suppose for a lyric poet with the brain, he'd say, well, the muscularity of my thinking is not what it was when I was in my 20s. But for me, literally, I'm feeling it's tough to keep, to just the energy that it takes is just exhausting. I was absolutely, completely shot after 10 minutes of whales. And so I often think, I'm not going to be able to do it, and soon I'll get to where I can't photograph anymore, because it's just really, really hard, to photograph. And
is the painting as demanding physically?
It's in another way, but it's a way that's more, let's say, appropriate to my age and my time of life. There, the problem is not letting the brain go crazy under what it's turning up. So that's why I do it in restaurants or crowded places.
That's where I first met you.
Yeah?
You were saying it.
Yeah.
We'd come to have lunch, and I saw someone over there painting on film. I said, that's got to be Brakhage.
Yes, well, I don't do it to show off. I do it because if I'm among...
Well, people here are used to seeing you doing it.
They are, actually, and they're very nice about it. Every time, including today, someone came over and said, what are you doing? And I explained to them, and they're usually interested or not. But it doesn't bother me. What would be really bothersome is if I tried to do it in here alone.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. Then I was going crazy under that when I started with the Roman series and the Arabic series, and those were photographed films, remember. But then I began painting again in earnest in some way, and that I could not do that very often here. And if I did, I started slipping into scary things in the head.
You mentioned Robert Johnson a couple times, and of course the last time I ever saw him was here in Boulder. He gave that reading at the theater, and he was partly here because of you.
Yes.
How did you come to know him?
He was entirely here because of
That's my
it was my insistence. I said, well, we have to have at least one poet.
How did you come to know him?
I met him early on at, I think probably Robert Duncan's first of all, because Jonathan Williams and he were always together. And Williams, of course, was publisher, published Duncan's books and other people's. And they were they were like a, lifetime companion, homosexual couple. And Ronald Johnson, I remember the first time, I think it was The Green something, it's a book of his called
Book of the Green Man.
The Book of the Green Man took me, and I was quite surprised. I said, well, my God, this guy has really got something, because I just took him as sort of like a companion to Jonathan Williams, but he was very quiet. But this book really impressed me, and so I began reading his poetry. And then I met him not long after that at Guy Davenport's, that Jonathan Williams came through Lexington, Kentucky, and they were together, and we spent several evenings together, and I came to quite like him. Then I didn't see him for years and years. In fact, I didn't see him until he came here. I, however, did call him on the phone, correspond with him when I first found the books of Arc. The first 3 books of Arc that were published and won prizes and so on. And then they were being remaindered, and I picked them up in a used bookstore, and I just had to talk to him. I called him and I said, these are fantastic, these are great, where's the rest of the poem? At which point he told me it wasn't available, no one would publish anything more. I said, after you've won all these prizes and everything, they won't publish? No, he said, I'll send them to you. And he did, by God, send me, about that many typewritten pages, which I took to Vancouver Island on our summer vacation when I began the photography of A Child's Garden in the Serious Sea. And that's why it's dedicated to him, is because suddenly his poem, I would be reading his poem, and then I'd be going out and photographing, and he would, it was all one somehow, and it was the most direct inspiration I've ever had for poetry was Ronald Johnson that summer. And then later, of course, then he wove a little reference to me into the poem later, and he was very excited. He went to see the film, and he was very excited by it. So when they said, well, who should we bring, and I know for some reason Michael McClure couldn't come, and I said, well, the one who's been most active is Ronald Johnson, and I hadn't seen him for 30 years. Yeah, I hadn't seen him since the 60s in Lexington, Kentucky. And our atmosphere to get the proper slingshot effect, so that he could study the moons of Saturn. And I said, how can you do this? I feel like I'm talking to a Nazi or something. When are you going to start making lampshades out of people's skin, or what the fuck is this? It just absolutely enraged me. And nobody seemed to have any understanding of it. I brought it up at the distinguished professors, and most of them are scientists. They said, well, of course we need to study the rings of Saturn. And then nobody, the only one was David Hawkins, said, well, I do think that it isn't right to put people at risk without everyone voting. And I think if you asked for a vote of the world as to whether they wanted to take this risk, you wouldn't get permission to do this. And he was the only one, though, and so I said, well, I've got to do something. So every hour on the hour, I went out there and I inveighed against it.
The picture didn't explain that you were doing this on an hourly basis.
Every hour. Every hour on the hour, I was out there raging against this project
and a good film, right?
And warning people at what's going on over there. I said, we don't even know what else they think they're free to do, what genes they're experimenting with, what germs. And I said, so I call for a moratorium on the science departments in this university. Well, once the probe went up, then I had to end sometime, so I did. But in a way, I think if I were really sane, I would be out there right now every day, at least once or twice, letting people know that the irresponsibility of these scientists, these people who have, for example, I just give you a simple example. It isn't even murderous, but it certainly shows what they are. One of them I've come to know fairly well because I'm doing a project with him on George Gamow. McCrae is his name, and he's an astrophysicist. And he's a decent enough man and so on, but he was a part of the dean's committee to decide to study and see what was needed at the university. And so I'm at a meeting then of the distinguished professors with the dean, and we're asking him, well, what did you decide? And at some point I said, well, did you deal with compression? The fact that your older professors here are not being compensated equal to inflation, so that they're all sinking against inflation. Everyone's wage is going down, whereas you're hiring new people at a reasonable price, or you couldn't hire them, and you're cheating. You're all being said, well, we decided we couldn't do anything about compression. I said, that's very interesting. I said, was that a humanitarian decision or was it a scientific decision? You know, and suddenly there was a big hubbub again. Here I was, the only humanities person in the room. Well, that's not quite true. Hazel Barnes was there, but she tends to side with the scientists. I don't know why. She's impressed by
The scientists are getting higher salaries, probably.
They're getting higher salaries anyway. They don't have this problem, you know. Then the next thing I asked, the discussion went on and on for a while, and I said, well, did you make did you look into the absolutely disgusting new medical insurance policies that have been doled out to everybody this year? No, they hadn't looked at that at all. I said, well, all I can say is that your report, while I hope it isn't really very impressive to the dean, for all our sakes, it certainly isn't going to be impressive to any of your colleagues in the rest of the university. In fact, it's absolutely disgusting and cowardly, in my opinion. Well, you know, this makes me persona non grata among the distinguished professors, and I just feel at some point I'm going to get so mad I'll quit. And because it was like, you feel like you're talking to people that, and I respect them for their intelligence and what they've achieved. I mean, I could even be in awe of some of the things that McCrae has accomplished in terms of looking at the stars and so on, but you feel like you're talking otherwise to people that are absolute mental defectives, and they have all this power.
Well, there's absolutely no good segue between that and the next question I had, but I was curious.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
If you had anything with East Coast poets, like when you were in New York, did you have anything like the kind of correspondence and relationships that you had with those West Coast writers?
No, I did not, with the single exception of, well, I don't know how you count Creel. Of course, I really encountered him through Ed Dorn and Olson then through him, and so in that sense I had that triangle of deep associations, and also some few others, but basically what you'd call your East Coast writers, which is Ashbery, O'Hara, so on and so forth. I had no touch with any of them but Zukowsky. I to this day cannot understand Ashbery, even though I read Michael Palmer, and I don't understand him easily, but I find him more accessible than I do Ashbery. And I don't think he intrinsically is. I just think it's a matter of my ability to associate with a certain aesthetic. I'm not saying better or worse, I'm just saying myself personally. The only other exception is Robert Kelly, and whom I went up to visit several times at Bard. But Kelly came to me through Duncan, as did Zukowsky. I met Zukowsky at Kenneth Rexroth's in San Francisco when he came with Paul, who was going to play the violin in a concerto with the San Francisco Symphony. So I had those associations, and then to the extent to which you might regard Parker Tyler as a poet, and he might be one. I mean, his long poem on introducing film tactics into poetry is certainly intriguing. But he, of course, I met again through Duncan. And but the others would be like Willard Moss, who was of a generation of kind of classic academic poets. And I never respected Willard as a poet. I would have George Barker, and I'm still reading George Barker and find him fascinating, but not Willard. Marie soon became Marie Mencken, his wife, the major inspiration on my work there. So the answer essentially is
Not really.
Not really. I didn't really connect with what we'd call the West Coast poets.
The East Coast.
I mean, the East Coast poets.
Well, of course, Dorn and Cleary were more peripatetic and Western-oriented in certain parts of their careers.
Well, you know, another one should be mentioned is Helen Adam, whom I always liked, whatever she wrote. She spent the last part of her life living in the East, but in total neglect.
Yeah. Well, and still writing those ballads to her.
Yeah. Almost total neglect. I think once they gave a kind of off-Broadway production of San Francisco Burning, but
and she appears briefly in that Poetry in Motion film, I think in her apartment reciting something.
Yeah.
That's about it. One last question. You remember a lot of remember this, but I was reading the Mina Loy biography when you called to talk to Anna one day.
Oh, yes.
And I mentioned, I just got to the page where Jonathan Williams comes to Aspen to interview Mina Loy.
Yes.
You said, I was there.
Yeah.
What was she like in those Aspen years?
Very frail, very old, and I was just a fly on the wallpaper, really. I mean, I didn't interact with that at all, other than to say hello. Well, a lot of it I couldn't understand, but I have a recording of those meetings.
Well, you must have done something right, too, because in the Brakhage you're talking about some
Blackburn was
Dada fellow who had come up to Colorado, and you said that he never even invited Mina Loy to anything.
That's right.
So you had some sense of her, obviously.
Oh, yes. I mean, I knew about Mina Loy from the 50s even, because I was interested in her poetry in the 50s. And beside the Luna Bedecker being reprinted, I don't know if the rest of her poetry has been reprinted.
Well, what they've done, for years, those of us who were interested had to get the Jonathan Williams edition to box it. I had thought they were doing a collected Loy, and what they've done instead is still not all of it. So you actually need the Williams edition and the new edition to get most of her poetry. But someone's working on it collected, so I think within the next 4 or 5 years.
I would surely hope so. It's just shocking.
You mentioned Blackburn in passing. You didn't have
Yes, yeah, sure. Yeah, we met Creeley's down in Placitas, New Mexico, you know. Yeah. And I knew him all along, in and out. He was always around. He was like constantly in and out. And I never cared for his poetry very much, though I do like his translations of that French medieval poet.
Not Bertrand de Born, but I know what you mean.
There was a book put out of his translations of a French medieval poet. I thought he brought that very much alive. He was a good translator, as often people that aren't terribly good poets are often very good translators. Like they need to live through someone else. They have enough in them to put something into English that's certainly at least poetic, if not poetry. And they're often good translators. In fact, that's finally what I regard Rex Roth as being. He's a great translator, and I can't get very excited about his poetry in itself. Do you still?
Well, he has some of that kind of Cubist stuff is intriguing to me. That's about it. You mentioned that you read Palmer. Is there anybody else from subsequent generations that you find interesting?
Christopher Dudney, I did for a long time, but I'm very upset with turnings in his life and in his books that have occurred, so I'm on the point of, in some probably a very stupid rage, throwing everything out, because he did seem to be writing in the tradition of Olson more solidly than anyone else, and was certainly unique what he was doing in himself, and yet somehow he's come to betray that in some ways. But I'm not totally sure. You always think, well, maybe I'm not up to seeing what he's doing. But I also know things in his life, like he's now a spokesman on the CBC or whatever for this and that in some way that tends to make one suspicious. Doesn't mean it couldn't happen. We all wish it would happen. We all wish Charles Olson had been put on the CBC or the public broadcasting system or something, and why wasn't he? But the truth of the matter is the way in which he talks on the CBC is disturbing. It's almost like he's turned his back on some aspect of his poetics that people would regard as obscure, or by which they really mean difficult, and they're not willing to make the effort. And whereas I find the early things on his district, he was making this vast poem on the geography and the geographical repercussions of the district of his living, which is to say, Ontario. were fabulous, beautiful poetry. Let's see, who else do I have?
The very last question I have, and as a reader, this is the obvious one. And I would not want to see you take a moment from your work in film to do this, but can we expect any more collections of your writing? You think so?
I don't have. I did write a little polemic for Bard College because they put out such a good magazine, but now they put out a lousy one. Some of the students graduated, and new students came along and put out a thing that isn't even decently proofread, and so,
Oh, well.
Yeah.
But there is
up and down. I will lead them up and down, as Buck says.
There are some uncollected writings around, though, because you give talks and things. Like some of those must.
Well, none of my books are in print.
Right.
Nothing. So I'm would be very happy if someone reprinted some of my books, because I think some of them have been important to filmmakers. The only thing that's ever interested me in my writing, and I've been very careful not to insult the muse by having illusions about my writing, but the only thing that I've ever cared about would be to inspire people about film as a possible art form, and especially the young people. And I know that Metaphors on Vision did that for many, many people, and I think it's sad that it's out of print. I think it's needed to be back in print. I know they're going to put, this one's totally out of print now, but McPherson is going to put Film at Wit's End back into print, so that'll be something. I know also there's, Taft came to town, and Foy went around recording him and me talking as the painter who did that painting up there, and Philip Taft, and we did several days of conversation, out of which they made, I think, a very decent book. But that's also, it's like a $75 book by some gallery, and I imagine it's out of print now too. So essentially, except for when McPherson puts Film at Wit's End back into print, I'm out of print. And another thing that was supposed to be done, but I can't seem to interest anybody, and I've given up writing for that Canadian magazine. But if you want more of my writings, you could write to Music Works in Canada, in Toronto. I can give you the address. And they have 10 years of 3 issues a year essays by me, including, it ended on an entire book, which is on Canadian painters and filmmakers, with a lot of emphasis on Jack Chambers.
I'll follow up on that.
So that would give you, and I mean, I think those come pretty inexpensively. Anyway. If you've got American dollars, Canada's inexpensive, which is the only reason we can go there.
Well, if they won't sell them to me, I'll give them through your library.
Or the library should have them. It's a good collection because it's also got beautiful writing by John Cage and David Tudor and all the major composers of Canada and the United States across the last 30, 40 years. And they've somehow invited me in to run. Some of my essays are about music also, but most of them are concentrated on aesthetics in general, not just film, but poetry and painting, history of music, of course. And psychology, I did like a study of Anna Freud's writings. I did some careful reading of Anna Freud. See you shaking your head. Anna Freud? She's wonderful. Wonderful writer.
Did you have anything you were dying to ask while we were talking?
I did at one point, but I've just been enjoying this. So.
Well, thanks again for taking the time to do this,
pleasure.
especially with the heat and everything. Yeah.
It's helpful to you. Be delighted for you to do that. I think it's a good way to end that of all the poets that I've known and care about, and I don't run a competition among them, but the one that has become the most important to me in the long run of all this reading is actually Michael McClure. And that kind of rather surprises me. So I think that should be said, that by this time in my life, it's not really the Cantos anymore. It's Michael McClure that has been turned out to be for many years, and certainly is now the most inspiring of all the poets, and not just his poetry, but his plays and his essays and so on. So
One of those suppressed productions of The Beard was at San Jose State, where I used to teach, long before I got there. But they got arrested there, too.
yeah, well, it's so silly. I mean, what's really ridiculous is that there isn't a collected poems of Michael McClure or a whole edition. I mean, he has created the most unique form. And by the way, no one makes mention of it, but Ronald Johnson is primarily inspired by Michael McClure's formal approach to a poem throughout ARC.
Oh, you know,
And no one makes mention of it.
You know who else did those centered lines?
Yeah.
Tolson.
Well, Tolson, yes,
Yeah.
right, and you introduced me to...
And he was
yeah,
doing that around
yeah,
the same
yeah,
time
yeah.
as McClure, come to think of it. Yeah, that's interesting.
So that is a version of poetry that is absolutely, I mean, I don't want to make much of it because you could regard it just superficially, you know, but that isn't really what's the meat and essence and spirit of what one's reading, but one has to note that this is a really unique form of poetry, and it's really Michael McClure's. Because I think Tolson doesn't do it in the Liberian.
He does it particularly in Harlem Gallery.
Yeah, but
yeah,
that
no,
comes
Liberia,
later, doesn't it?
That's I was already writing it. It doesn't come out until '65.
But you see, even when we're talking Michael McClure, we have to say 1958. Olson recognized his poem on Wales, and that was his form, and he's stayed with that form across his whole life, actually. So I really think, I mean, not that these things, in a way, don't, you know, God makes these forms and they come through people, but one has to note that it's come through him with this vibrancy and stayed with him and been the bell of his reverberation across his whole life. And
well, he's another one who's very generous. People. I had an MA student in San Jose who wanted to write his thesis on McClure. And McClure not only gave him interviews, but gave him access to his archives.
He is generous. I told him I was so much missing the playbooks that had gone south when I got divorced, you know. And he just sent them all to me, individual volumes, just poured them out to me, and I don't repay him. I sent him painted.
There you go.
He and Amy Evans like these, so I sent him these painted things.
Now I'm glad we have that on film.
That's mine.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
Oh,
Before we go, I want to get a still picture of the two of you together.
Yeah, sure.